President Talon, today I strip away every diplomatic pretense. The era of measured words and careful phrasing has collapsed under the weight of what we've witnessed. I speak to you now not as a politician crafting statements for international consumption, but as a soldier who has walked through the ashes of villages that should still be standing, who has held the hands of mothers who should still have their children. This is not diplomacy. This is survival. And in survival, there is no room for the language of those who have never paid the price we've paid. Look at what surrounds us, President Talon. Look carefully at the architecture of pressure being constructed around Burkina Faso, around the alliance of Sahel states, around every nation that dared to say no to the old arrangements. We are not blind men stumbling through darkness. We see the patterns, we track the movements, we decode the silences that speak louder than any official statement ever could. And what we see from your borders, from your partnerships, from the spaces you allow to exist in the shadows of your sovereignty, it troubles us deeply. It troubles us because we recognize the signature of strategies that have destroyed African nations before. We recognize the fingerprints of powers that have never, not once in their entire history, acted in Africa's interest without extracting 10 times the value they claim to give. You know what we learned in these years of fire and blood? We learned that the most dangerous weapon ever deployed against Africa wasn't the bullet or the bomb, it was the gray zone, the space of plausible deniability. The territory where advisors operate but governments claim ignorance. The bases that exist for partnership but somehow always position themselves exactly where they can monitor, influence, and if necessary, strike at those who refuse to comply with agendas written in foreign capitals. We learned that Africa has been destroyed not by open warfare but by the quiet tolerance of presences that should never have been permitted. By the acceptance of arrangements that sound reasonable in conference rooms but translate to control on the ground. By leaders who signed agreements they didn't fully understand with powers who understood everything and revealed nothing. I'm not here to accuse you of malice, President Talon. I'm here to warn you about complicity, because in this moment, in this region, there is no neutral ground. The forces that circle the Sahel right now, they're not interested in coexistence. They're interested in submission. They want the old order restored. They want resource extraction to continue without African voices setting the terms. They want military installations that give them strategic depth across the continent. They want our youth to remain in poverty so desperate that any wage they offer looks like salvation. And they will use any opening, any relationship, any border, any government that gives them even the smallest foothold to achieve these objectives. So when I see movements near your territory that align suspiciously well with pressure campaigns against Burkina Faso, when I see patterns of cooperation that mirror exactly the playbooks used to destabilize Libya, to fracture Sudan, to keep the Sahel in perpetual crisis, I don't wait for proof that would satisfy a European court of law. I act on the intelligence that keeps soldiers alive. I respond to the patterns that history has taught us to recognize, because the price of being wrong about peace is a speech at the United Nations. The price of being wrong about threats is the annihilation of our people. The alliance of Sahel states was not formed because we woke up one morning and decided to be difficult. It was forged in the absolute necessity of survival. For a decade, President Talon, we fought with one hand tied behind our backs. We operated under restrictions imposed by foreign partners who claimed to be helping us, while their rules of engagement ensured we could never actually win. We watched terrorists cross borders and disappear into zones where we were forbidden to pursue them. We saw weapons flow through corridors that international forces somehow never managed to intercept. We buried soldiers who died because the intelligence we needed was held by partners who shared it only when it served their interests, and those interests rarely aligned with ours. We broke that system. We accepted the consequences of breaking it. We knew the sanctions would come. We knew the diplomatic isolation would follow. We knew the propaganda machines would paint us as rogue states, as juntas, as threats to regional stability. We accepted all of that because the alternative was extinction. And having made that choice, having paid that price, we will not allow anyone to recreate the conditions we escaped. Not through military bases on neighboring soil. Not through proxy forces operating from safe havens we cannot reach. Not through diplomatic agreements that sound benign but create the infrastructure for intervention. This is why I speak to you with such force, President Talon, not because I want confrontation with Benin, but because I see the construction of a strategic environment designed to strangle the AES without the international community being able to point to a single overt act of aggression. I see the patient assembly of capabilities that could, when the moment is judged right, be activated to apply unbearable pressure. I see the recreation of the encirclement that has destroyed every African attempt at genuine independence. And I'm telling you now, clearly, irreversibly, we will not allow that encirclement to complete itself. We will not wait until the noose is tight to realize we should have acted when it was still being woven. We learned from Gaddafi's Libya, from what happened when an African leader who challenged the system waited too long to recognize that diplomatic assurances meant nothing when strategic interests were at stake. We learned from every African nation that tried to navigate between competing powers and discovered too late that there was no middle ground, only the illusion of one maintained until it served someone's purpose to collapse it. You might say this is paranoia. You might say we see enemies where there are only partners. You might say we're manufacturing threats to justify our own authoritarian tendencies. These are the talking points. I've heard them from every Western capital, from every think tank that receives funding from the same governments that sold weapons to both sides of African conflicts. But I've also seen the bodies. I've walked through the ruins. I've looked into the eyes of children who survived massacres that happened in territories supposedly protected by the largest military intervention in Africa's history. I've watched the international community express concern while doing nothing, express regret while changing nothing, express solidarity while maintaining every structure that produced the crisis. So forgive me, President Talon, if I don't trust assurances. Forgive me if I don't believe in the good intentions of powers that have left a trail of destabilized nations across 3 continents. Forgive me if I treat every ambiguity as a threat, because in my experience, ambiguity in security matters is where African people die, while lawyers debate whether technical violations occurred. Your territory is sovereign. I acknowledge that completely. But sovereignty comes with responsibility, and one of those responsibilities is ensuring that your soil is not used, actively or passively, deliberately or through negligence, to threaten your neighbors. This isn't an abstract principle. This is the foundation of regional peace. If Burkina Faso allowed forces hostile to Benin to operate from our territory, you would rightfully consider that an act of aggression. The same logic applies in reverse. The same standard must hold. Now I know what the response will be. You'll say there are no hostile forces in Benin. You'll say your partnerships are legitimate, your cooperation agreements are transparent, your territory is not being used for any operations against the AES. And maybe, in the narrow legal sense, that's accurate. But I operate in the world where intelligence services create plausible deniability as an art form, where military advisors technically don't engage in combat but somehow always end up directing operations, where bases established for counterterrorism somehow always position themselves to monitor and potentially strike at governments that displease their sponsors. I operate in the world where every African crisis of the last 60 years involved external powers claiming they were only there to help, only there at the invitation of legitimate governments, only there to promote stability, while they systematically dismantled every attempt at genuine independence. So when I see patterns in Benin that match the patterns that preceded interventions elsewhere, I don't wait for the smoking gun. I don't wait for the moment when denials become impossible because the attack has already occurred. The doctrine of the AES is preemption based on strategic pattern recognition. If we identify the assembly of capabilities that historically precede aggression against African sovereignty, we will disrupt those capabilities before they reach operational readiness. We will not ask permission. We will not submit the question to international bodies that move at the speed of bureaucracy, while threats move at the speed of military operations. We will act to preserve our survival, and we will accept whatever diplomatic consequences follow, because we've already survived sanctions in isolation and we know we can endure them longer than our enemies can maintain them. This is not a threat against Benin as a nation or against you as a leader. This is a statement of strategic reality. If elements operate from your territory that threaten the AES, whether you control those elements or not, whether you fully understand their objectives or not, we will treat their presence as a threat to our existence. And threats to our existence will be eliminated by whatever means prove necessary. I say this publicly because I want absolute clarity. I want no room for misunderstanding. I want every power that thinks it can use African territory to play games with African sovereignty to understand that the Sahel has changed. We are not the leaders who will smile for the cameras while betraying our people. We are not the governments that will sacrifice national interest for international approval. We are not the states that will accept slow strangulation because rapid resistance looks too aggressive to international observers who have never lived under the conditions they expect us to tolerate. President Talon, you have choices to make. I understand the pressures you face. I understand that powers with far greater resources than ours can offer inducements and make threats that genuinely constrain your options. I understand that breaking with established partnerships carries real costs. But I need you to understand the position of the AES equally clearly. We have already made our choice. We have already accepted our costs. We have already burned the bridges we needed to burn. And from this position, we will not allow those bridges to be rebuilt through our neighbor's territory. You can be part of an Africa that charts its own course, that controls its own resources, that determines its own security arrangements, or you can be part of the structure that resists that Africa's emergence. These are the only two positions available now. The middle ground has collapsed. The space for countries that wanted to benefit from both the old order and the new has disappeared. History is forcing a choice, and that choice will define your legacy and determine your nation's trajectory. I'm telling you this directly because I respect you enough to be honest rather than diplomatic. The international system runs on lies, politely told. We're told that structural adjustment brings prosperity while it produces poverty. We're told that military partnerships enhance sovereignty while they constrain it. We're told that resource extraction deals benefit both sides while one side remains poor and the other grows rich. I'm done with that language. I speak the truth even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs me international sympathy, because I'd rather have the hatred of powers that have always opposed African liberation than their false friendship. The Sahel is rising. That's not rhetoric, that's not propaganda, that's observable reality. We're building indigenous military capacity. We're forming economic partnerships that don't require us to surrender control of our resources. We're creating political structures that answer to our populations rather than to foreign capitals. This terrifies the old order. They can see their influence eroding. They can see the model they controlled for 60 years beginning to crumble. And they will fight viciously to prevent our success from inspiring others. That's the real threat, President Talon. Not that Burkina Faso wants to attack Benin, but that the success of the AES threatens every neo-colonial arrangement on the continent. If we demonstrate that African nations can secure themselves without Western military presence, if we prove that we can manage our resources for our own benefit, if we show that we can create prosperity without surrendering sovereignty, then the entire architecture of control collapses. And those who profit from that architecture will do absolutely anything to prevent our example from spreading. This is why I speak with such urgency. This is why I cannot accept ambiguity. Because the forces arrayed against us are vast, experienced, and utterly ruthless. They've destroyed governments before. They've torn nations apart. They've created chaos that lasted for generations. And they'll do it again if we give them the opening. So when I see anything that looks like it might be that opening, I respond with overwhelming force. Not because I'm aggressive by nature, but because history has taught me that in conflicts between African sovereignty and global power structures, there are no second chances. You have the opportunity to be remembered as the leader who stood with Africa at the moment it truly needed unity, or you'll be remembered as the one who maintained partnerships with those who worked to keep Africa divided. I cannot make that choice for you, but I can tell you with absolute certainty what the AES will do in response to each option. If you stand with us, even if you don't join us, even if you simply ensure your territory is not used against us, you'll find neighbors who respect your sovereignty and defend your right to chart your own course. If you allow yourself to become a platform for forces hostile to African liberation, you'll find neighbors who view every ambiguity as a threat and respond accordingly. The time for careful positioning is over. The time for trying to please everyone is finished. The time for maintaining relationships that contradict each other is done. We're at the moment where Africa either breaks free or accepts permanent subordination. And I've decided, Burkina Faso has decided, the AES has decided. We choose freedom regardless of the price. The question before you is simple. What does Benin choose? Because your choice will determine whether we move forward as partners in liberation or as neighbors divided by the fault lines others have created to control us both. Choose wisely, President Talon. Choose quickly. Because events are moving faster than diplomacy, and the consequences of miscalculation are catastrophic.